The capacity of the human system is always bigger than most people imagine. The classic never judge a book by its cover.
One of the reasons we wanted to have this conversation was to really tease out this idea of okay, you come out of service and you want to build a company. Who is that appropriate for? Who is it not? If you do decide to do it, what are the things you should be thinking about?
You can be an entrepreneur and not have to be building your own company.
You looked at these human optimization, high performance skills. What makes people internally really good and able to perform at a high level? And then you were able to take those ideas and help translate them into something in the civilian sector.
If you live and work in a high stress environment and you don't have the right tools to sleep well and deactivate and manage your nervous system, that takes a toll on your health.
For too long, those that have worn the cloth of the country, that have fought and sacrificed for our nation, have been left out of the greatest financial engine the world has ever seen. My service paved the way for my success, and that's true for so many veterpreneurs. In fact, some of the greatest companies were created by veterans. I'm your host, Kaj Larsen, and in each episode, we'll bring you the stories and the wisdom of those who have gone from boots on the ground to successful careers, from military to wealth, and how they've done it, so you can apply those insights to your own mission and life. Welcome to Tactical Wealth, from military to money. All right, before we get tactical, if you had to sum up your journey from Navy service to entrepreneurship in one sentence, what would it be?
An act of accidental intentionality.
Nice.
I'll
Happy
get into
accident.
that 100%. I always say that the story of Arena Labs is in some ways accidental and in other ways decades in the making. We can kind of deconstruct that. A lot of it has to do with service, not just in the military, but seeing my mom as a nurse and growing up in a household that was service-oriented.
And what's one moment from your time in the teams that has sort of reshaped how you see the world?
I think in special operations in general, I think the reverence people have for the special operations community is this. I often say it's overly mythologized, but at the end of the day, it's very cliche, but it's about the people. I think for me, going back to early days in training, you truly begin to understand, A, the capacity of the human system is always bigger than most people imagine. And B, the classic never judge a book by its cover. I think of some of the most capable men I served with, and how initially you would never understand their capacity, either intellectually or physically or just in terms of pure heart. And I do really aim to bring that into how we think about our work now and just how I live in terms of how do you find the deeper part of someone else's well and getting to know them.
I am super excited about today's episode, in part because we share such similar trajectories, Naval Academy to SEAL teams, to fancy graduate schools, to entrepreneurship, attacking that world. And I've wanted to get to know you for a long time. Obviously, we have similar mindsets. That's how we pick similar outfits without even coordinating. Today's guest is Brian Ferguson. He is the CEO and founder of Arena Labs, a company that helps medical professionals perform in an optimal way using tools that are rooted and grounded in human performance science. He's advised the Pentagon. He's collaborated with top performers across the domains and discipline of medicine, sports, and defense, obviously. And he is committed to unlocking human potential at scale. Brian Ferguson, welcome to the podcast. I am so honored to have you here.
Thank you.
Honored to finally meet another SEAL, another fellow colleague who's stepped off into the void of entrepreneurship.
Thank you.
Amazing. So let's start with your background. How did you come to your military service? Is this a family tradition?
Yeah, so to make it as succinct as possible, I think we were just saying before that could talk for days on some of these themes, but I really did life backwards. I did not join the military until I was 28. I was 29 when I started, basic SEAL training, and 30 when I finished.
You had to get a waiver, right?
I did not. I was right on the cusp. I was 28. So I was actually living in Florida. But the reason I joined was multifold. I had grown up in a house of service. My mom was a nurse. So I always say, at Arena, we talk a lot about the service archetype. I think obviously listeners here are, people are coming out of uniform or, they're a spouse to someone in uniform. I think when you live around that, it's hard to see the world through any other lens than service. I always thought I'd go into medicine, and I ended up studying international relations in college. And then the summer after 9/11, I went to a public school in Ohio called Miami University. And the summer after 9/11, I had an internship in the White House, and really changed my life. I had a front row seat to history. I then went and worked in national security, first in the White House and then the Pentagon as a civilian, kind of a low level, at the time, I was around extraordinary leaders and thinkers, but really seeing how the world was changing. Simultaneous to that, my younger brother served in the Army. He had gone into infantry ranger school, and then he was in special operations. And so here I was in the Pentagon, and I was 28 years old. I love national security, but I knew I didn't want to spend my life as a civilian. I felt like I would miss the chance to serve. And there's a longer conversation, I think, on a number of elements around that physicality that I was really drawn to. But later in life, I had a number of mentors in national security who really helped me understand the role I might play and the opportunity. And frankly, got lucky. I almost missed the chance, but yeah, it was an extraordinary journey.
Yeah, 28 is late in life to go through buds. I mean, there was a point where it was like waiverable to 30, and I think the oldest guy.
Yeah, so I think at the time it's probably changed, but in 2008, I think it was 28 was the cutoff for an officer. You had to get into OCS, and then 35 might have been the cutoff for enlisted. So yeah, but I the deal. I would say, like, most things in life, within reason, being older is nothing but an advantage. Now, obviously, for the military, you have to keep your body in good shape. But if you've done that, like, more experience and reference points is nothing but an advantage.
And so when you graduated, Buds, where'd you go? What were you?
I went to the West Coast.
Okay.
Yeah.
As did I. West Coast, best coast.
I really was lucky. Had some extraordinary mentors, and I was out there for 6 years and just really lucky.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you did that's maybe unique in the officer pipeline is you really worked in some innovation within the SEAL community, within the special operations community. Can you tell me about what you did and how that kind of helped prep you for what you did on the outside?
Yeah, I think I reflect on it now. It's funny. So I've been out of the military for 9 years, which is a bit surreal. And I think about that era, again, kind of 2010. When I was in the Pentagon, there was a huge focus. If you think again about what 9/11 did, is it changed the way we thought about conflict and war, because we were no longer fighting a nation state. We had this, a decentralized networked enemy, and that meant we had to think differently about technology. And so I was, in those years, I was between two secretaries of defense, Secretary Rumsfeld and then Gates. But there was this emerging focus on, you could quickly see how technology was just changing the battlefield. And so I was really fortunate to be around the emerging tech landscape. And then I went and worked for a leader actually down here in Florida named Admiral Jim Stavridis. And Stavridis,
extraordinary guy. Well, we just incidentally, I met him when I was a fellow at Tufts University at the Jepson Center for Counterterrorism Studies. One of the greatest thinkers, military civilian minds ever. He's 100%. So inspirational.
And it's and I think for listeners, especially if you're interested in entrepreneurship, like the thread it pulls is, and we come back to this, but like, you can be an entrepreneur and not have to be building your own company. And Stavridis was in many ways, I think, like, he had that very strong entrepreneurial bend, but he was focused. So he had built something in the Pentagon called Deep Blue, which was the early days of the Navy, thinking about innovation and just frankly bringing unorthodox thinkers in. I met him when he was Secretary Rumsfeld's senior military advisor, and he actually became a mentor who helped me get into the Navy. But Stavridis, when he got his 4th star, became what's called a combatant commander. So
he was a PACOM commander, right?
Well, he was actually here in U.S. Southern Command in Doral, Florida. So I lived in Miami at the time working for him. I was on assignment from the Pentagon. And what Stavridis was doing that was very interesting was he understood, as the national security community was modernizing, we had to think differently about how we leverage the private sector in innovation and entrepreneurship, the whole spectrum. And so he built something down here that was engaging with the private sector on things like counter-narcotics and the shipping industry. So as you can imagine, the cruise ship industry sees a lot of illicit trafficking. And he was the guy thinking about, okay, how do we build better relationships there? So I worked for Stavridis and learned a ton about how you think about emerging technology in the bigger landscape of a bureaucracy. Fast forward, by the time I was in the Navy, I went from the West Coast out to Hawaii. I work for a very sharp leader named Travis Schweitzer, who's the Commodore for basically undersea special operations, to make it layman's
Group
term.
3, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so at the time, Captain Schweitzer, Travis was trying to understand. He saw that we had, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were dying down. And those wars, I think there's a longer conversation to say in many ways they were a distraction technologically about what we'd need for, you think of today's world and sort of the near peer competitors of China, like very different ball game. And so Travis was an early visionary that saw, okay, as we're returning to the water, here he is leading the undersea special operations footprint. He wanted to think about how to bring emerging technology into that space. And so once I decided to leave the military, my last job was building this undersea, essentially innovation cell. Which for me was a dream job if I wasn't on active duty, because I was working with people who were thinking about bringing new technology into this domain.
Yeah, there's some fascinating micro lessons there as well. And I think the two of them that you kind of touched on are just about mentorship in general. Like you got Jay Stavridis, who has these tentacles into influencing so many of us that he touched, right? Into these alternative career paths or into an entrepreneurial mindship. I'd put myself in that category, having read his book, like having been mentored by him at the Jebsen Center, and then Travis Schweitzer, obviously, right? Like that sort of culture of innovation, and then you translate that outside. Because I think one of the challenges for people when they get out of the military is like there's not a huge civilian market for underwater demolition, right? There's nobody you can't really put that on your monster.com LinkedIn resume and people are like, oh, I need that guy to blow up a boat for me, right? So what do you think are like the skills that you actually pick up through military service that are most translatable in the private sector?
I thought a lot of coming in this because a passion of mine, and I'm grateful for what you're doing here, is like how, I've intermittently over the last 9 years done a lot of work with people transitioning out of either special operations or other parts of service. And I struggle, I like, what is the meta lesson? And I think number one, we were talking before the show, I think especially in special operations, people are entrepreneurs at heart, but that doesn't mean you should start a company. And I think most people in the military are hungry to have a high sense of agency and impact, which is usually not going to come when you're a cog in a large organization. So the question is, where do you fit? I think for me, probably the meta lesson that I take away of those leaders, number one, it's very cliche, but it's about people. And then how do you think about for yourself the threads that allow you to feel like you're still serving something bigger in creating. And I think that again is like it's a trite statement, but where I see people struggle is we take for granted when you're in military service, you're always serving. Like that's the subtext of everything. And I think when you leave and just dive into something in the private sector that's strictly about revenue or profit, it just sucks the soul a little bit. So you have to start with like, how am I going to pull that thread of service? And then like, what's the risk calculus I'm willing to take in this next season? And that's totally different for everyone.
Yeah, I think that part, when you at least consider the culture of entrepreneurship, and I think one of the reasons we wanted to have this conversation was to really like tease out this idea of like, okay, you come out of service and you want to build a company, like who is that appropriate for? Who is it not? If you do decide to do it, what are the things you should be thinking about? So let's talk about that risk calculus and that risk profile. Like it's different if you serve 20 years, you're used to a regular paycheck, maybe you have your TSP, but you have like a family to support, like the slope for entrepreneurship is steeper, right?
Yep. Yeah, to hit that quickly, what I do, some of the work I've done in around this question is, I think at a basic level, someone going into special operations has a pretty high individual risk calculus to say I'm betting on myself. When if you go 20 years and you come out and you've got 3 kids and you're the sole income earner, it's a lot harder to have that same approach. However, if you shift your risk calculus to 0, I think that's where people end up really yearning for something more. And that's the work to say, where on that spectrum am I going to shift? I will say, starting a company, I advise most people against that because it is insanely all-consuming and difficult, as you know. However, what I see now is like the people who've come out, and in some way that I think, Kaj, the thing that I often, the starting place, I mentioned service earlier, but when you're in the military, especially for 20 years, like you sort of forget your time is someone else's at the end of the day. And so it's the reason people squabble over, a per diem trip or dive pay, because it really is like you don't have any other way to make money. And so that becomes a point of contention. When you get out of the military, your time is now wholly yours. And so I think the way to start is to say, I call it this sort of portfolio lifestyle. When you're getting back up that learning curve to say, where do I want to sit? The more you can control your own time and allocate it carefully to being around new mentors, new people, new challenges, it helps make that clear. Now, I know that's challenging if you've been in for 20 years, but I think there are still more creative ways to do it than to say, I'm going to take a full-time paycheck and give my time again, but now it's going to be a big company where there is not that threat of service. And I think that's where you start to see a real tension for people.
Yeah. I mean, look, I felt this tension myself when I got off active duty. I said, never again will I be in a position where somebody can tell me, like, you have to do this and you have to go there, and you have zero choice or else they'll throw you in jail, right? And then somebody reminded me, like, well, that's okay because outside of the military, indentured servitude doesn't really exist. So you're good. You're absolutely good. But I do think this is an important principle. One of the things that you talk about that I think is so profound is this idea that you can be an entrepreneur without starting your own company. Yeah. Explain that to people so they understand.
Yeah, I mean, there's some of these words feel a little corny, but the idea of intrapreneur is one that comes up a lot. And, the question is, if you exist in a large business or some sort of a large infrastructure that's a big set of companies where you have a lot of autonomy and creativity to either focus on leadership or mentorship, that allows people to feel like they're building and creating. The classic definition of entrepreneurship is starting something solely on your own. Now, that might be if you're going to go out and just, a lot of people get out and want to be sort of advisors or coaches. I think that always hits its own limit where you start to realize you're exchanging time for money, and that becomes its own indentured servitude. I went through that when we first started Arena. We were a services business, like a consultancy. I was on the road all the time. I was in hospitals all the time, and it was grinding me. But the classic, I think the definition people sort of revere is, I'm going to go out, I've got a big idea, I'm going to start a company, I'm going to raise a ton of money. With that comes insane responsibility that, inside the military, even on the hardest day, you always know you've got a huge institution behind you to back you up, whether that's, literally in kind of being rescued in a bad situation tactically, or just in, a legal dispute. When you're building something on your own, one of the sort of early hires in our company, Glenn Trachtenberg, uses this great analogy, which she says, when you're an entrepreneur, in some ways you're glamping, right? Or you're in a big company. And glamping is, hey, like, you're trying this thing, and if it doesn't work out, I'm going to go back inside the main lodge, and I'm going to, I've got nice toilets and infrastructure inside, warm showers. Building something from scratch is like being in the Alaskan outback.
You're in the hinterland. Yeah.
And if you don't figure it out, it is existential. Like, the company goes away, and if you put all your chips on that, that means you're back to square one, and that is a very high risk calculus. So that's where, like, there's a whole longer conversation there. But I think sometimes it's okay to go out glamping if you've earned it for 20 years in the military and you want to have some of those creature comforts for your family. That's totally reasonable.
Yeah, and I think the takeaway there, it reminds me of this great anecdote, which I heard about Elon one time, which is that when Elon got fired from PayPal, the company that he had founded, he took all of the money that he had, and I mean literally all of the money, and he reinvested it into PayPal, in the company that had just fired him. And he went out to dinner with his family that night, and his ATM card got declined because he literally had taken every penny he had and put it into a company that had just fired him. A lot of people with families are not willing to sit at the restaurant and have their ATM card declined. So his risk calculus, this risk portfolio profile that we're talking about, is obviously very high. And I do think it's actually a caution that probably special operations folks specifically need. Sometimes I like to think that sometimes the same skills that made us successful in the teams and in the special operations community, we have to modify some of those 100%. Instincts when we translate them into the private sector, right?
Yeah.
In the teams, you are rewarded for running through a wall. In the private sector, you can more often be rewarded for figuring out, like, how to go around the wall, how to tunnel under the wall, how to go over the wall. But you don't necessarily need to, like, never quit by all means necessary.
Yeah, and there's an identity element to that too, which is when you come out of the military, what is more important, I think, in the spirit of this discussion and what Tactical Wealth is doing is just complete the hero's journey. And this is Joseph Campbell's idea of like, at some point you have to come home to yourself and say, how have I changed? Because again, that the calculus you made going in, when you join the military, that higher risk calculus, you want to keep some element of that. Like that's clearly in your soul to take risks and do hard things. But especially if you've got a family and that landscape's changed and you've evolved as a person, that means you probably have to think about things differently. And, I look at, when I started Arena, I was not yet a father. And now I have a daughter who's 6. And I even see, if I'm being honest, my risk calculus has continued to change because I think that's just innate, that's human nature. And I'm also at a point where like once you start to build for a while, you want to de-risk things. Early on, you need that I'm all in mindset to build anything worth, I think, its value in the world. But that, it's a real deep conversation to say, what does that look like?
Yeah, I really like this idea of like the dynamic nature of identity because I think we've seen it so many times. Guys who are like still trying to be that guy in the same way. You will always be that guy, but you don't necessarily have to wear it on your sleeve like in the same way. And in some ways, it can be a hindrance to further growth. I want to talk about Arena because I'm actually personally very interested in it. So you come out of the SEAL teams, you have a really interesting cadre of experience because you had done stuff in the private sector before. Why the healthcare sector?
So back to my story, which is why in the front end we said, how to describe it in one sentence, sort of accidental intention. I think the intention for me was I always wanted to be around service. It was a subtext of my life. Several of my uncles were in Vietnam. Both my grandfathers were in World War II. It was never expected. I always kid around. My parents were both 60s hippies. My dad was definitely a hippie who, there's a whole nother story there, who I saw, I think, grapple with being more in a traditional role. Like he didn't pull that inspired soul of creativity in himself. He was a talented musician, but all that to say, my mom was a nurse, thought I'd go into healthcare. And so serendipity being what it is, when I was leaving the military, I met a heart surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic. So the Cleveland Clinic is ranked #1 in the world now for like 30 years in heart surgery. And heart surgery is really interesting because in a lot of ways, it's similar to special operations. You've got a team of 8 to 12 people in a time compressed environment, meaning when you stop the human heart to do surgery, the longer that person is on this machine that is pumping the heart artificially, the higher the risk of stroke. So there is just a subtext of having to move fast. There's pressure and stress. And so I went in, it was fun for me because I went to this place where, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. This is, where I'd grown up. It was this revered sort of shining star on the hill. And here I am at the #1 place in the history of the world for heart surgery. And on one hand, I was blown away by the technological advancement of the modern operating room. On the other hand, life came full circle. I realized that my mom is a nurse. Doctors, surgeons never get access to the basic tools that were foundational in military training and that are foundational for athletes and a lot of creative performers, which is how do I manage myself, especially in a high stress career. And so that, there's a longer story that I'll save for now. But when I was going through training, because I was a bit older, there's a guy named Kirk Parsley who had been a SEAL and became a medical doctor. And he was the medical doctor to the West Coast SEAL teams. But Kirk was early on looking at the signature of what's called high allostatic load, wear and tear in the body from stress over the long arc of a SEAL career. And Kirk's work 10 years later was published and now is known as operator syndrome. But operator syndrome basically says if you live and work in a high stress environment and you don't have the right tools to sleep well and deactivate and manage your nervous system, that takes a toll on your health. And so, the world...
Yeah, it's essentially like, in layman's term, being in a state of like fight or flight for a sustained period of time.
Yep.
Yeah. And there's deleterious effects, right? Yep. Like to that from a hormonal perspective, like from physiological perspective, all that
Yep.
stuff.
And I would say like right now in society for any listener, this is becoming more mainstream. Yeah. Like these wearable devices, whether you have a Whoop, an Oura Ring, an Apple Watch, people are learning about the importance of sleep, recovery. And most people feel more stressed today than they did 5 years ago because of social media and pressure. So all that to say, that experience led to this conversation with that heart surgeon to say, how come you guys don't train these tools to manage yourself? And he said, we don't have time in medical school or nursing school. That led a long journey to what we now call high performance medicine. And the provocative question we ask is, why don't we give frontline medical teams the same tools, coaching, and data as other high stakes, high stress professions?
Yeah, I really like this lesson a lot for guys and gals who are thinking about transitioning out, right? What you did is you looked at, in similar ways to what our friend Rich Davini did, is you looked like at these human optimization, high performance skills, what makes people internally really good and able to perform at a high level, And then you were able to take those ideas and help translate them into something in the civilian sector.
Yeah, and I'm always like, I feel really humbled. I really had an unremarkable career in the teams in the sense, when I got out, I really wanted to stay in, but I was older, and but it was unequivocally the most extraordinary experience of my life. And when I really boil it down, I think of number one, like standing on the shoulders of giants, the amount we were learning at the time about the human system under stress and pressure. You had a small community of guys who carried the load at 2 wars. Many of these people, my mentors. And when I sort of got out into the civilian world, I say the one time in my life I saw a coming tidal wave no one else could was human factors. I saw that these wearable sensors were going to change the world, and to land in medicine, this service world, and say, wow, like how do you guys not think about it? Not just what special operations is doing, but pro sport is doing this, the creative arts, and so I think it's tough when you're wired that way and you see a problem that seems solvable and no one's working on it. It almost becomes this thing that like you can't look away from. And so it's taken, I think for me, I feel if nothing else, the special operations community allowed this connective tissue of all these extraordinary people that either been mentors to me or were 1 degree removed for someone who could help solve that. And it's just been invaluable.
And where's Arena Labs at now? What stage of the entrepreneurial journey are you at?
What's interesting about Arena's story, we were pre-COVID, we were a services business. So we would deploy into hospitals. We would take a multidisciplinary team of people. So it maybe some people from the military, the creative arts, sport, embed in a hospital for up to 6 weeks and be in the clinical spaces, meaning the operating rooms, the ICU, the ED. And then we would run workshops to train doctors and nurses on the same tools that were either part of the military or the creative arts community or sport. When COVID happened, and we started using biometric sensors in about 2019 to get an objective signature of stress. Post-COVID, so that version of the company burned to the ground when COVID happened because all of our contracts were to be on the ground and we were non-essential personnel. So I went through having to rebuild the business as a technology platform, and that was in 2021. We hired a whole new team, and that's been remarkable. It's its own challenge building a technology and data company, but we've got a small team of 20 people. We've done 2 smaller rounds. It's not for this discussion. I've got pretty contrarian views on how to think about being capital efficient and trying to control more of your own destiny. We're still a human performance company. We offer human coaches, but we have to do that through technology. So we're not a classic kind of venture capital company. So we've done 2 rounds of funding, and now really grateful. We've got partnerships with many of the best hospitals in the country, and we're still very much in the trenches learning and scaling.
Yeah. Well, I'm keenly personally interested. I don't think we've talked about it, but my sister's an ER physician.
Amazing.
And I've watched her and her community live with the stress, especially through COVID. And I've watched what's happened in the medical community writ large. So I understand the demand signal when it comes to doctor burnout, how few tools they're actually given through med school and residency in order to deal with. And they also, the medical community, specifically the ED where my sister works, had this black swan event, right?
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, it's so interesting. If you were to, the sort of comparison of you and your sister, the tools that were innately part of what you learned, your own passions now outside of the military, and here your sister's also clearly a service archetype. She's deeply devoted, and what we see in our data, the most intense signatures of stress and allostatic load are 100% ICU and emergency room physicians. Because in COVID, for the listener, if you think about most people who had COVID ended up in emergency department, a lot of times passed away there or went to the ICU and passed away. And so those people saw insane loss.
Unbelievable. My sister, who's like my best friend, we talk about this all the time. In fact, we have like a little moniker in our family for it. We call it her job and my job, right? Saving lives and taking lives, which seem totally disparate and opposite. But in reality, the underlying human factors, in terms of stress, combating stress, are almost identical. Yeah. And so it's so interesting how her and I can shorthand between her profession, my time as commander in the SEAL teams, and really the parallels are uncanny. So,
and I think it's really just to hit that. I think and it's what we see is that at the higher order back to, I think when someone's just thinking through the lens of transition, like the service component of that is like clearly it's in your DNA for both you and your sister. And so if you're not continuing to pull that thread, like you end up feeling empty. But one of the top values in our company is service. You don't have to have served in the military, but you have to understand what it means to believe in something bigger than yourself, Because as humans, when we do that, number one, it's part of living I think, a deeply fulfilling life. But if you don't have the tools to protect against the better angels of your nature, you end up in a huge deficit.
Absolutely. I want to transition to one of my favorite sections of the podcast. It's like I say, it's like shooting steel. It's rapid fire. You get instant feedback. So put you in the hot seat for a second. All right. Best investment you ever made?
VA loan.
Excellent.
Yeah.
First person to say that.
Yeah. And I actually think, this is rapid fire, but just a quick context there for the listener, if you haven't used it, like, I think it's probably, from a financial perspective, I did not appreciate what an amazing instrument that is, but very fortunate when stationed in Hawaii to have bought a house out there, and like a place I wouldn't have sniffed otherwise.
Yeah.
I grew up in a pretty blue collar environment where, I had so much stress buying that house, but the military allowed that, and super grateful.
It's one of our big lessons here on the podcast is like how you maximize the full umbrella and spectrum of benefits out there. VA loans, one that we haven't hit on, so I appreciate that. All right, on the flip side, dumbest financial mistake you've ever made?
In that same period, had just bought this house and had like, maybe 50 grand that I should not have been spending and just investing it, and put it into, got like classically drawn into this quote unquote sexy world of Silicon Valley investments, and I invested in a company through friends that was gone in like 3 years. And and like what had no business, didn't really understand the technology, it just seemed cool, and it was like a hard lesson in the distractions of investment. I mean, all the classic things.
$50,000 lesson in early stage.
And you think about that point in my life, that was a lot of money.
Yeah.
I mean, even now it still stings when I think about it.
A military habit that you carry into the civilian world?
I think it's just rigorous stewardship of my mind and body. I mean, I think that's like unequivocally what I love the most about the special operations community. I would say, like, when I was in the Pentagon and I was around these special operations leaders, they were not only physically capable, but always intellectually curious. And I think those combinations of traits allow for that's ultimately, to me, human potential over time.
A book that helped shape your mindset?
I'm going to go with two. Well, I'd say mindset in particular, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor, like classic 101 on attitude in life. When I was actually living here in South Florida in 2008, really struggling. I was kind of older, like, do I join the military? I had a reasonably successful career in national security. Like, do I take this risk? And I read The Alchemist. In Paulo Coelho, it can feel cliche, but it is a deep exploration of listening to the heart in one's sort of inner yearnings, to steward your own life, and that really changed the arc of my life.
First thing you do in the morning, or morning routine?
This is kind of a real-time change of answer. In the last 2 weeks, what I've shifted back to, and you can appreciate this, Kaj, in building a company, I got out of the routine of working out first thing. I love getting up early. I've always loved the solitude and quiet of the morning. So up until 3 weeks ago, it was I would sit in my library in the dark and just either meditate or write. I now get up and go right into working out, because the dynamism of my day, I kid myself saying I'm going to work out later, and I was really finding myself in suboptimal shape. So now it's just start with a workout. Yeah,
and we've said it so many times, both on this podcast. You and I have hit on it a bunch. Keeping your knife sharp physically is kind of essential to dominating other domains of life.
Yeah, and I will say, is that just for the listener here, I think it is an important consideration when you're looking at your next. What are you moving into? I think a lot of people discount the need for physicality. People join the military because they love being physical. You're literally paid to work out. Most places you go work after the military are not going to pay you to work out. And so, but if you can find a place that does, I think there's that skews higher in thinking about what is wealth.
Yeah, absolutely. Health is wealth.
Yeah.
Another theme that we hit on constantly. Great. How can we follow Arena's journey and your journey?
Yeah. So,
and more importantly, how can I get my sister on the program?
Yeah, we'd love to have your sister in. I mean, we are. Anyone, I will say, is a sort of self-serving here for our team. If you're listening, you have someone in your family who's a clinician, doctor, nurse. Our work we call high performance medicine. arenalabs.co. And you can find us on Instagram @ArenaLabs. Just generally these conversations, I am passionate. I will say, like, as a plug, anyone listening to this, I mean, I think like you, I am really committed and love helping people who are trying to ask the question, do I want to start a business or be an entrepreneur? And so please reach out there.
Brian, thanks for your service and your continued mission. Hey, thanks again for locking in with us today. I hope this episode stimulated the old brain housing unit. Step one to becoming richer is becoming smarter, and I hope some of the lessons and ideas from today have sharpened your knife. As always, I hope you're taking notes, but more importantly, that you're taking action. Thanks again to Siebert.Valor and Siebert Financial for the support, and remember, stay tactical, stay driven, and don't forget to bang that subscribe button.
Tactical Wealth is a Gebbia media production, brought to you by Siebert.Valor, a military-focused initiative from Siebert Financial. The Tactical Wealth podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. The views expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of Siebert Financial. This podcast does not constitute investment advice, an offer to sell, or a solicitation to buy any securities. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Listeners should consult a qualified financial professional before making any investment decisions.